Hello, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. It is I, Glen Kyle, Executive Director and would-be historian, here to answer your questions. I always love doing these. Libba keeps telling me they're popular. I don't see how they could be because I enjoy them so much, and how can something I enjoy also be something that someone else enjoys? It just feels selfish. But we'll go ahead and try to get to some of those questions and answer those. And one of the ones, I've gotten a couple of comments, questions about a particular thing. So lots of things have been happening in the country. There have been protests. Some of those protests have turned violent, and there has been property damage and things like that. And, you know, one of the themes I've seen running around is people are comparing it to the Boston Tea Party and, you know, saying that, well, violence does sometimes achieve things. And here's a great example of how patriots fought against tyranny. And how could you possibly say that it's not the same thing happening today? Well, history is always complicated. And as one of the things that I have bemoaned several times is folks always sort of want to cherry pick a little piece of history they know a little bit of something about and turn it into something to support their cause. Now, don't get me wrong. If history shows us anything, it shows us that violence can settle a lot of issues, right? A lot of issues are settled by violence. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's necessary. But the way violence is used is really the context that you want to look at that. So let's take specifically the Boston Tea Party, and I will tell you a little bit about how the Boston Tea Party went down. And I can then back up a little bit. So in the period following the French and Indian War, Britain finds itself in control of the entire North American continent. It's not having to compete with Spain. It's not having to compete at all with France, its old enemy in the expansion into the North American world. And so it finds itself totally in charge after having fought a very expensive war that it needs to pay for. So it's going to enlist the colonists in North America to help pay for the incredible expense, all of the loans and things like that, which Great Britain feels is somewhat fair. And as the taxes are levied against the colonists start to feel that the way those taxes are being levied is a violation of their rights and makes them feel like second-class citizens. And the Stamp Act itself does end up having a lot of protests that turn violent, and quite frankly, some of these Stamp Act protests and riots have a lot more in parallel with some of the modern stuff that's been taking place in Minneapolis, but I'll get there in a second. So they repeal most of the Stamp Act, but they also put in place sort of a tax on tea and a requirement that tea has to be traded from the more or less government-owned monopoly of the East India Tea Company, or the East India Company that trades in tea. And this is something the colonists don't want to do either, because they've had no say in how the tea is going to come here and the fact that it's a monopoly on tea. And so a ship comes into harbor. It is a privately owned ship that is carrying East India tea. This comes into Boston Harbor. And the Sons of Liberty, who grew basically, were created during the Stamp Act crisis, decide that they're going to destroy all of this government monopoly tea as a sign of protest. It is destruction of property. It's destruction of mostly public property. Again, it's sort of private property, but it's a government-controlled monopoly by the East India Company. And the Sons of Liberty, when they decide to do this, are going to be very careful that their protest, although it has violence and destruction of property at the center, is very directed and is very specific. They agree beforehand that no other personal property will be harmed except for the tea. They agree that none of them will take any of the tea or personally profit financially from this event. So they dress like Indians. There's a little bit of a questionable quasi-racism for you just to seem like, so no one knows who is actually participating. They dress like Indians. They sneak aboard the ship. They're forced to break a lock, like a padlock, to get into the hold, and then they take the tea out and they start dumping it into the harbor to destroy it. One of the men is actually found to try to be sneaking some of the tea off, and his fellow compatriots stop him and force him to throw the tea overboard so he doesn't personally profit. The very next day, the people who participated in the Boston Tea Party send the ship owner money to recompense him for the loss of the padlock. So all this to say that the Boston Tea Party, yes, they did destroy property as a means of protest, but it was very focused. It was very specific. And I think the lesson to be learned there is that it was organized, it was not chaos, and it had a very specific purpose and a very specific agenda, and therefore it could be used in a very specific form of marketing to show what they had done, to show they were responsible, to show that they were the injured parties and the responsible parties. Now, I'm not going to get into all the issues with the things going on, because there is a lot of pent-up angst, just like there was in the colonial era as it led towards independence. But I think when you look at how protest, peaceable assembly can transform into a violent act, that can be understandable. But sometimes when you want to compare things to history, sometimes people pick the wrong things. Like I said, if you wanted to look at some of the Stamp Act riots and protest, those would be much more of a parallel than the Boston Tea Party. So there's some, like I said, I've gotten some questions about that one. There's my take on the Boston Tea Party. But another question that we've just gotten is about the French and Indian War. And again, it seems like I'm going back in time rather than forward. But the French and Indian War was huge, right? Most of us see it today, and most of us were taught about it in school sort of as little more than a prelude to the American Revolution. It doesn't stand on its own. And yet, I would argue that in a global sense, in a worldwide sense, the French and Indian War was more significant than the American Revolution, because it determined the power structures and how these huge, powerful European countries ended up fighting each other and negotiating with each other and relating to each other on a multi-continent basis. And it all started right here in North America, in the colonies. And really, the French and the English had different approaches, and the Spanish too, had different approaches to how they were trying to use the North American colonies to profit, whether it was just by trade, exploitation of natural resources, gold, silver, or actual colonization, planting people on the land. And that seemed to be the most stable, but the problem is if you plant people on the land and you plant more and more people on the land has to come from somewhere. And the Native Americans had already been living here. And so their land being taken over by the European settlers becomes a major issue. And the French and Indian War is fought mostly by the British Army and the colonists in North America against some Spanish regulars, but especially against the French in what's now the Northeast, around the Great Lakes region, around northern New York, and up the St. Lawrence River. Again, I'm compressing a whole lot here. But that war settles about 150 years of dispute between the two great European powers, France and Britain, and also forces a particular peace on what will come to be the European nations, which leads directly from the 7 Years' War, as it was known in Europe, pretty much into the French Revolution, which leads into the Napoleonic Wars. And so the French and Indian Wars of their own right are very interesting to study, not from just a military perspective or from an American history perspective, but from a larger social and economic perspective, right? Because the countries involved have so much at stake, and Great Britain's strategy is to take the North American continent no matter how much it costs. And of course, that cost has to be dealt with later, and that's sort of how you get the American Revolution and the Stamp Act crisis and the Tea Party and things like that. But France, I think part of France doesn't really get how important it was. The great Voltaire said after France surrendered its North American possessions that all we have lost are a few acres of snow. Well, it was a little bit more than that, Mr. Voltaire. You're very smart in some ways and not very smart in the others. But the war itself started small, grew to Europe, became big, and really defined how America was going to relate with Europe. And the after effect was the American Revolution. It's not the other way around. At least that's my take on it. In a nutshell.
All right. This is Libba from Behind the Scenes, so that I can get your questions out there. Everybody can hear them. So our next question is, when and how exactly did the Democrat and Republican parties wind up flipping several decades ago?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a complicated one. when you look at historically, let me back up. The history of parties, of political parties in America, is a complex one. A big reason it's complex is because at the founding, when they were developing the Constitution, they did not take political parties into account. They knew about them. They hoped that America would not fall into what they considered a sort of a debased form of political debate that would resort to faction, as they called it, to parties. And so the Constitution really didn't have anything built into it to account for separation of political constituencies and members of Congress into parties. But of course, this happened almost immediately because parties, for all of their bad things, are also the way to coordinate getting things done, those in power and those in opposition. It's a way of sort of settling what the stakes are going to be, what the sides are going to be, what the arguments are going to be, and it makes it nice and neat. So in the beginning, there were, of course, the Federalists who believed in a stronger central government. There were the Anti-Federalists, which eventually became the Democratic Party. The Republicans, actually, yes, they were the Republican parties. Jefferson believed in led by Jefferson, believed in a decentralized sort of authority where the power resided with the states. And then the Federalists sort of phased out, and then the Democratic Republicans were the party in charge, and then they started to shift, and then you get the Whigs, and then you get a new party, Democratic Party, and then the Republicans come along under Lincoln. And so by the time you get to 1860, the election of Lincoln, the Democratic Party has become still sort of that decentralized, very strong in the South, decentralization of power. And the Republican Party is focused on sort of a centralization of power, on obviously an abolitionist platform, and efforts to use the federal government to sort of further the greater good. And after the Civil War, it's mostly more or less the Democrats and the Republicans. And this is an interesting thing. In American history, parties tend to come and go, and they tend to redefine themselves and sort of realign. And to get to the question of what happened when the Democrats and the Republicans sort of realigned a few decades ago, we're sort of overdue for a major political shakeup. They only sort of realigned. So you get to World War II, and it's the Democratic Party under FDR, right, that sweeps. He has 4 unprecedented terms, and they control the House of Representatives and the Senate to a certain extent, and it's the Democrats that are in charge. And here's the other thing about American political power is one party is in charge, and sometimes it looks like they're almost unassailable, but something always happens, and people get tired of the way things are doing, and they'll vote for the opposite party, sort of just because. So then, after World War II, the Republicans sort of, even though FDR got us through the Depression, got us through World War II, was a great war leader, people get tired of it. They want change, and so the only way to do that is to vote for the opposite party. Then you get folks like Eisenhower and folks like that, and then the Republicans come into power. Then you get the 1960s. Kennedy comes into power. He's young. He's effervescent, and they're going to change the way America does things. And the Civil Rights Movement begins, and the Civil Rights Movement sort of more or less connects itself to the Democratic Party. And people are supportive of this, and then America gets tired of it, and you see a sweep back towards the Republicans. That's when you get Nixon back into office, and it keeps going. And then Nixon, and then all the scandals with the Pentagon Papers and Vietnam and Watergate, and that sort of totally erodes American faith in the government, especially, but in the Nixon administration particularly. And so they're tired of it. They vote for Democrats, and you get Ford, and then you get Carter, and then we have Ford and Carter, and then an economic not a depression, a sort of a recession, right, hits in the 70s with Jimmy Carter, who came into office full of hope. He was supposed to be a political outsider, and things around the world happened that he didn't really have control over. The Iran hostage crisis, the issues with OPEC and with a shortage of gas and everything, and that just weighed really heavily on his administration. And when it looked like, which is an unreasonable expectation, the president couldn't do anything about it, they got tired of it and voted again for a conservative movement under Reagan, right? And Reagan comes to the campaign table and tells people it's morning in America. It's a very positive message, and Reagan gets 2 terms, and then you get his vice president, George Bush, elected into office, and during Desert Storm, he has a 90-something% approval rating. Huge, probably the highest any president has ever had. And yet, by the time you get to the next election, he's voted out of office because people are tired of it, right? That's when you get Clinton in office for 2 terms. Then you get a conservative, George W. Bush. Then you get a Democrat, Obama. Now you've got a Republican, Trump. Things keep going back and forth. And one of the ways that parties handle this is they sort of have to go with the shifting sands of public sentiment and sort of take possession of particular political ideologies that seems to fit their constituency that will get them into office. So I'm sort of mixing in the ideological, the historical, and the political all at once. And so now you get to the point where, the Democrats are the ones who are more interested in centralizing things and trying to use the federal government sort of as the main mover and the impetus to try to get good things done for the country. The Republicans are the ones who are now more about a decentralized approach to have more power be in the hands of the individual states and in individual freedoms. The Republican Party in 1860, its platform was abolition, the removal of slavery over African Americans. Now you get to where most, not all, but most African Americans tend to identify with the Democratic Party. So these switches occur slowly over time. They're not something that happens overnight like that. But a lot of it is, unfortunately, sort of driven more by politics than ideology. A political party will see a particular constituency, they'll adopt that constituency's concerns, and that will get them elected into office. So the switches that you're kind of talking about of how the parties go back and forth is politically driven as much as it is socially driven. So in the next 20 years, who knows what's going to happen? Like I said, we here in the United States are very, very much overdue for a party split, for a party overhaul. It's been going on, historically speaking, way too long. So if I had to predict something, and why not, I don't have anything to lose. I think in the next decade or so, you're going to see one or both of the current political parties split, and you're going to see some other political parties form that are more reflective of the American body politic than you have with these very limited binary systems that we have now. Whew. Long and drawn out, but I hope that kind of got to what you were talking about.
Our next question is, who discovered America?
That's a good question. So let's do what the boring historians do and say, let's define our terms. What do you mean by discovery? Do you mean someone who found it the first time? Do you mean someone who found it after a lot of people had forgotten about it? Do you mean someone who found it after a lot of people have forgotten about it and then took the time to go back, tell other people, and bring those people to it? So there's a lot of things. So, if you're talking about the landmass, the first people here were those people who became the Native Americans who crossed probably the Bering Land Bridge across the Bering Straits and occupied this hundreds of thousands of years ago, occupied the North, Central, and South American continents, or the North and South continents, with Central America obviously being the part in between. And they lived here for thousands of years. We do believe now that at some point there must have been some sort of Chinese expedition that may have landed on what's now the Californian coast, on the western coast of North America. But they didn't come back. So they might have come, they found this weird landmass, and then it took them so long to get back. And for the technology at the time, it simply wasn't something that was repeatable. The Scandinavians during the Viking period, right? Vikings came to North America, to Newfoundland in the very, very northern part there. And they even established a settlement. We know this. This is historic fact. And yet they ran into a lot of different issues, agricultural issues, troubles with the Native Americans. So they went back to Scandinavia and didn't leave a settlement. And therefore, the New World was more or less forgotten for another 500 years. Wasn't a concern. Then you get someone who was trying to find a route to Asia, Christopher Columbus. And an important thing to remember, too, at this point is that the technology, the maritime technology, the navigation technology had improved to the point where Columbus could cross the Atlantic against the trade winds, right? He's sort of going against the depending on how you get there. I'll talk about that later. It's not an easy trip to get from the coast of Spain to the Caribbean islands, much less to the mainland of North America. But he does it. He leaves some people behind, and his plan is to go back, tell people about it, and bring more people, to bring a larger expedition. And he does that. And then, of course, this is a time post printing press, or when the printing press is just coming into being, so the reports of what he's found are able to spread wider, faster, to a bigger audience. And the Portuguese, the French, the English, and other seafaring countries start to send their own expeditions across the Atlantic and land in some of these areas. So when you talk about discovery, so Christopher Columbus, that's why we think of he and his expedition as the folks who discovered America, because he's the one who continued or began the process with the technologies available at the time, both the printing press and maritime naval technology, to start an exchange, a permanent, lasting exchange of peoples, of ideas, of plants, of animals. That's why we call it the Columbian Exchange. If this is the case, then why wasn't America named Columbusia? Why wasn't it named for him? Because he still thought that he'd run upon Asia and not some new place. There was an Italian named Amerigo Vespucci. You have to do your hands when you say this. And he also had a voyage come over, and he began to think, you know what, this is not just an island, this is not just Asia, this is an entirely new, huge landmass that no one expected to find here. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to start publishing that fact rather than a route to Asia. Thus, America has its name from he and not from Christopher Columbus.
Our Welsh friend David asks, so he's heard about a folklore about a Welsh prince who sailed to America in 1170, over 300 years before Christopher Columbus. Are you familiar with that? Is there any truth to that?
I have heard a little bit of that, and it's hard to pin down the sources. As a matter of fact, as far as written traditional sources, we have, I think, one source that says a Welsh prince went to a far-off land. But here's the interesting thing. It seems like he probably sort of would have followed the route that the Vikings would have followed, because that's the shortest route from northern Europe to northern North America, is to follow the St. Lawrence down. The interesting thing is there are, and I cannot remember which tribe it is, but settlers moving west into the American interior discovered a Native American tribe that had very red hair. Some of the people had very red hair and had green eyes, which is not a typical trait for Native Americans. And so looking at the biological evidence, some of the DNA evidence, it does suggest that at some point there seems to have been some sort of Welsh or Irish, very, that push to the edges of Europe, Celtic peoples who did find their way to North America, landed here, intermarried with the Native American populations, and that biological outcome was still there. There doesn't seem to be any other easy and realistic explanation as to why these Native Americans would have red hair and green eyes. So I would say yes, there is some sort of truth to that, but how much that's become legend and myth, that's a story for a historian who studied that in more depth than I have.
Our next question is, who invented the automobile?
Who invented the automobile? Again, you sort of have to define your terms. There were efforts to create biologically driven, no horses, oxen, mules, or anything like that, forms of transportation. And really what happened was the development of the internal combustion engine. Some people had tried it with steam engines. They just could not produce the necessary power at that time anyway to mobilize something that weighed as much as a wagon or a buggy or a cart, because you have to remember the very, very first automobiles were literally horse-drawn carriages that they took the front part off and rigged up a motor to turn the wheels. So it literally is a carriage, literally a horseless carriage. But they, slowly began to work around ways to try to mechanize these and make them better, more modern, use steel frames. And then, the development of rubber wheels, those are amazing. But I cannot remember exactly who it was who's credited with inventing the first automobile. But we all think of Henry Ford when we think of automobiles. He was not the inventor of the automobile. Lots of people had made automobiles for sale before he had, but they were every single one almost a one-by-one custom-made piece of machinery, right? Every single one of them was made differently. It took an entire crew. They would come together. They would get an engine. They would build a body. They would put it all together one car at a time. This made them very expensive. This made it only available to very, very wealthy people. So cars were around. Henry Ford's the one who decided to create an assembly line process so that the efficiency of the Industrial Revolution could be harnessed and that cars could be made faster, they could be made cheaper in terms of materials as well as labor. And he's the one who basically popularized the automobile. And this is an important part of American history, not just because of the individual Henry Ford, but the results of what he did. So when you make automobiles, when automobiles come into play and are something that the average American can have access to, then you've got hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of them. You have to have infrastructure to support that. You have to have gas stations pop up everywhere. You have to have tire repair facilities. Mechanics pop up everywhere. And you have to have roads that pop up everywhere to accommodate this new means of transportation. That's why America, more than any other country, at least until recently, its communications, its roadways, its networks developed based on cars. We are still very, very much in love with and dependent upon cars. I want you to think about how much of our society and how much of our infrastructure is built around driving cars from one place to the other. Roads, bridges, car manufacturers, insurance, even our supplies are moved back and forth. When you go to the grocery store, everything that got there through a machine with an internal combustion engine. So it was the inventor of the vehicle is important, but the one who made it available to the masses, and how America built itself up around that common access to automobiles is really the big part of the story.
This almost sounds like a history joke, but when was the War of 1812?
When was the War of 1812? So, it did, you may guess, begin in 1812. Let's see if I can sum up here. So, America had won its independence from Great Britain in 1783. That's when the treaty was signed, where Great Britain recognized the independence of the United States. And let's see, if I do the math, what is that? 83 to 1812, that's like about 25 years. So it's only one generation away. And you have to remember that Great Britain, starting with the Revolution, was sort of always seen as the enemy, the great threat to American independence, because they kind of were. They didn't think America would make it. They didn't think of a democratic republic as a form of government would make it. They didn't think all these separate colonies, now states, could work together and not split off from each other. So sort of Great Britain was sort of sitting there at the side going, I'm waiting for them to fail, and when they do, I'll take them back one at a time. And that's how America viewed Great Britain, as sort of this threat. The French Revolutionary Wars happen. And this brings down one of the great central states of Europe. And it has this idea of anti-monarchy spread, and so Great Britain thinks it's going to lose its king and have its country forced into a bloody revolution as well. So they're very, very worried about this, and they get into a long, drawn-out war with revolutionary France with Napoleon at its head. England is a wealthy country, but it's somewhat small, and its great military power lies not in its army, but in its navy. And that navy requires tens and thousands of men to man the ships, and you're not going to be able to fill that voluntarily. So they not only have to maintain naval supremacy, they have to find men wherever they can. And they have to pull all their resources to fight this war with France. You have to remember the Napoleonic Wars, they're sort of like the World War II of the early 1800s. They are absolute, total war, death struggles between two great powers that involve a lot of other European powers. Actually every European power and a lot of their satellite states. And the United States keeps getting pulled into this. It has, of course, sympathies with Revolutionary France because Revolutionary France wants a representative government. They're sort of against the British because they fought a war to free themselves from the British, and yet they still share a common history, a common language, a common sense of who they are from the English. And so the Americans are trying to stay out of the war, but it finally gets to the point with British taking over American ships, with taking American sailors, and all the trade impingements on American trade, they finally declare war on Great Britain in 1812. This had been something that had been building for some time, and over the next 3 years, there is a war fought between Great Britain and the United States. The War of 1812 takes everything the United States has to fight. But you have to remember, Great Britain, it's sort of a sideshow because they're busy fighting off the forces of revolutionary France and most of Europe when Napoleon has them under control. When they finally defeat Napoleon, Great Britain turns its attention to the United States and says, now we're going to have a little conversation. And it looks like the United States may be crushed. Among other things, Andrew Jackson has an overwhelming victory over the British at New Orleans. They decide to simply stop the war because Great Britain has been fighting this war for over 10 years. They're done. They're also done. And they both decide to go back to the status quo ante bellum, which means the exact way things were before the war. So the War of 1812 ends in technically it ends the day after Christmas, 1814, but 1815 is really sort of the last battle. So it lasts that long, but we know, looking back, that that's the last time we ever really fought Great Britain in a war. But again, you have to remember the United States still sees Great Britain as a great threat and as one of its main political, military, and economic competitors for a long time, right? And some people, even when you get to 1917 and we're about to get into World War I, there are still some people that don't think we should get into a war on the side of Great Britain. So it's a very interesting dynamic there in that early part of history, but that's the War of 1812. That's the years that it occurred. That's why it occurred. Maybe more than you were looking for.
All right. I like this next question. They ask, if we were able to visit the Northeast Georgia History Center from Washington, what is the one artifact or story you wouldn't want us to miss?
First, please do come. I don't know if that's Washington, D.C. or Washington State, but either way, if you come to the Northeast Georgia History Center, I think, I can't remember if I've said this before, I think my favorite object is our largest object, which is the White Path Cabin. There's just so much neat history that happened there. It's a historic structure here on site. And we do a lot of our educational programming there, and it can take you back to the early period of this region's history around the 1820s, when Gainesville, the town that we're in, and Hall County, the county that we're in, were originally formed from Indian Territory, and it was originally a native home lived in and built by Native Americans. So the cabin sort of has this all-encompassing story in the one object that kind of tells a lot about this region, how it came to be, its very, very early years. If you're going to pin me down and ask me about something in the galleries themselves, we have a small display on Moonshine. I don't know if you're in Washington, you may not know that here in the North Georgia mountains, home distilling and the creation of moonshine is something that was done as not so much as a hobby, as a business, and it has a long checkered history of working against law enforcement and revenuers. A big reason it was done is because it was way easier and cheaper to turn a corn crop into moonshine than it was to take wagon after wagon load of raw corn to market. You could refine your whole corn crop down into a couple of wagons worth of moonshine and sell it for more than you could sell the raw corn for. So it was a good business decision. And this continued from the earliest periods all the way up. Well, some people might say it's still going on, but I don't know anything about that. However, there are some objects in the galleries that talk about this, and one of them is a yardstick. And it's just a simple yardstick like people used to get at grocery stores or at hardware stores and things like that. But this one says, don't drink moonshine. If you want to report it, contact Federal Revenue Agents, Atlanta, Georgia. And it has a little phone number there on the yardstick. And this always amused me because here's a yardstick that basically says, turn in your neighbors, start a mountain war and a feud over moonshine. You know, and again, this is what historians and especially museum people love to do. We love to take one little object that has one little part about it, and we can expand it out to this huge story. That's one of the reasons I love that yardstick. I've taken people in there, and I've spent 20 minutes talking about moonshine and corn crops and revenue agents and law enforcement in the mountains from a 3-foot-long piece of wood. Lord help you if you come to the Northeast Georgia History Center, but we would still love to have you.
And I would certainly encourage y'all to visit when we have our on-site programs, because a lot of our programming is basically museum theater, as you can imagine from our live streams that you've seen. All right, our next question is about the Civil War. It says, was Lee guilty of treason in the eyes of both the North and the South?
That is a very good question, and like most good history questions, it doesn't have an easy answer. Was Lee guilty of treason? On paper, yes, he was guilty of treason. When he went to West Point, the United States Military Academy, he swore an oath. When he was commissioned as an officer in the United States military, he swore an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States. So when he decided, when his home state of Virginia seceded from the Union, and he decided to stay with his home state, then technically he was a traitor to the United States. When you look at the complications of the issue, he was not a traitor to his home state of Virginia. He was not a traitor to his friends, to his neighbors, to his family that had grown up there in Virginia where he was at. Making these decisions on the eve of the Civil War, I think for us today has become sort of a foregone conclusion. Well, how could they possibly have made the decision that they made? That's wrong. They fought a war to support slavery and the idea that you could own other humans. They did. That's the main reason the Civil War was fought, to achieve Southern independence so that the Southern states could continue the institution of slavery. And yet, the decisions that each and every individual made were still not easy ones. They were smart people, right? They understood what they were getting into. They understood the complexities of the issues of the day. So, Robert E. Lee, traitor to the United States? Yes. Traitor to his friends and family? That one's a little harder to argue, I would say. It depends upon where your ultimate loyalties lie. So, Glen's first rule of history, is always it's easy to judge history and those who lived in the past. It's harder to understand them. But if you understand them, I think you achieve a better and more rewarding appreciation of what has happened in our past to inform us. So there's a long answer to a pretty complicated question.
Our next question is, let's see. Oh, can you talk about the Utah territory?
Oh, Utah! I can talk about it a little bit. You're probably getting towards the issue of the Mormon religions when the Mormons had gone out and were looking for a place where they could practice their religion freely. The Mormons have a religion that is not quite like most other Protestant religions in the United States. They have some interesting views on the divinity and marriage and things like that. And that difference from most mainstream modern Protestant beliefs tended to ostracize them, and they kept having to go somewhere else. So they finally went to Utah, right? And they settled in the desert. Actually, at that point, it was the Utah Territory, but the settlement grew so big and it was fruitful and it multiplied. So when the Utah Territory becomes a state, it has, if I'm remembering correctly at that point, has very much a Mormon majority in the new state legislature and in the new governor's office. And an interesting thing, too, I can't remember, one of our broadcasts that we've done before talked about this. When you look at Utah and Wyoming and Colorado and Nevada, they're very, very straight-liney. That has to do with that grid surveying system and how the territories were divided out. Utah may be one of the boxiest states in the Union. It's all pretty much straight lines because of that grid system. And so when the grid system was developed, the territory said, basically, this is what it's going to be. You can apply for statehood once you reach a certain population, once you develop your own constitution and things like that. And they did. Now, I can't remember what year they were accepted into the Union. I'm sure it was post-Civil War. Libby, you may have to Google that one real quick. Surprisingly, I'm not very good with dates. Secret about historians, most historians aren't. There's something in our brain that really makes us remember the events and things, but dates just fly right out.
And you wanted to know when Utah
Yeah, when did Utah actually become a state?
It's like January 4th, 1896.
1896. Wow, see how late that was? Because an area like that is, it takes a lot of people to get to the point where they can apply for statehood, and they're having to get a lot of people in the territory, and the Mormon majority, however, doesn't want a non-Mormon majority to get into the state and to start messing with how they want to do things. So Utah, even today, still has a very strong connection to the Mormon religion in its official and non-official institutions.
Our next question is, what is your definition of a historian?
Oh, what is my definition of a historian? I'm going to stare at the screen for a second. I think that a historian is someone who has dedicated a great amount of time and study to the past, to the interpretation of the past, to understanding primary sources, to synthesizing those into secondary works. I think that to be a historian, you do have to be degreed in history. I think that you can't just say, I'm an historian. If you've studied it like crazy, that's important. And trust me, I know a lot of amateur historians who know a lot more about history than I do. But having that degree just seems to add an air of officiality. I think it's because it's sort of a peer group. You've gone through something where you've worked with people of similar interest who are working towards a goal, and you understand the profession, if that makes sense, the profession of history. And even if you don't always align with the majority consensus, you understand the majority consensus, you understand how it was arrived at, you sort of understand how things work. So I think a historian with a capital H is someone who has dedicated a lot of effort into making that an official, real part of their life and their career. Now, that is not to say that one should be one's opinions or thoughts or studies should be cast away just because they do not have a degree. Like I said, I know a lot of amateur historians who do not have a degree in history at all, who I could sit at the feet of for hours and listen to their understanding of things, to the research they've done. And I think that one term that has sort of gone out of style that used to be is there were historians, who were the professors, the teachers, the people with degrees, and antiquarians. And antiquarians were folks who did study the past, and sometimes the antiquarians studied very, very specific parts of the past because it was their passion. When I was working at the Atlanta History Center, working with the Civil War collection and a lot of those muskets and rifles and ephemera of the material culture of the Civil War, there were people who had also dedicated their lives to studying and researching those details. They did not have a degree in history at all, but they knew so much, and they could tell you about it, and they could show you these things. So I think that would be my definition of a historian, but I would also say don't get too caught up on what that term can mean, should mean. If you love history, if you have a passion for it, anyone who's worth their salt is going to interact with you and talk to you and appreciate your perspectives, whether or not you have that degree to go along with it.
And David says it's a person who gets paid for having fun.
That's right.
I don't know how much you'll get paid, but okay. Our next question is: during the American Revolution, did Americans go to England to fight?
Fight like physically with muskets and things, not English soil. There were a couple of naval ships, like the famous John Paul Jones, who took his privateering vessel and actually attacked British ships within sight of the British coast and captured a lot of British ships and burned some of them to the waterline. But to my knowledge, there is no actual like land fighting or battle that went on English soil for the American Revolution. But if you will allow me a slight digression, I think it's important. Something that's not thought about with the American Revolution is we all know that France came in on our side and assisted, and at Yorktown it was the French and the Americans who defeated the British. But it's important to note that we had another very important ally in that war, and that was Spain. Spain came in and was, like France, looking to regain some of the territory it had lost in, that's right, the French and Indian / 7 Years' War. And there were Spanish soldiers that fought different battles, especially here in the South. Their navies made a huge difference. And the British, because the French came in on our side, the Spanish came in on our side, what happened is, rather than the British simply having to fight in North American colonies to put down a rebellion, when we got those major European allies, what happened is the American Revolution turned into a small version of a world war. Great Britain didn't just focus and couldn't just focus on the American colonies. Then it had to send troops to Caribbean islands. It had to fight in India. And so it spread Britain's resources very, very thin, which is a huge factor in contributing to American victory. So while Americans did not go to fight on English soil, there was a lot of fighting that went on that was not on North American 13 colony soil.
All right. Our next question is... we have Anna Miller, who is age 11, who wanted to let us know that her mom's birthday is tomorrow.
Happy birthday tomorrow!
All right, so our next question is, can you talk about the Truman Presidency?
A little bit. Some of you are starting to realize that the latter part of the 20th century is certainly a weak point in my grand historical knowledge. But Truman was FDR's vice president during his last term, and he's an interesting character. The atomic bomb, the creation of the atomic bomb was so secret, right, that FDR's vice president didn't know about it. And when FDR dies at Warm Springs, and they have to bring Truman in as his vice president to take over the presidency, and they start briefing him, explaining the atomic bomb to him is something that they then have to do. And the amazing thing is, so here's Truman, who is vice president, who's being briefed on the existence of this, for the time, super weapon, and it's going to fall to him to be the one to deploy it or not, to allow it to be used against the enemies of the United States. As it turned out, it would be Japan. So Truman is the president, the American president, who authorizes the use of atomic weapons against Japan, and he's the one who sort of reaps the victory of American forces in World War II. He's also the one sort of left holding the outcome of World War II, which is the beginnings of the Cold War. He goes to Potsdam Conference post-war, where he talks to Joseph Stalin and the British representative, and they try to come to an agreement. And Truman's the one who's very happy to tell Stalin that, yes, we now have this awesome weapon that we're going to be able to use, trying to impress him. And Stalin just sort of nods, because Stalin has spies and he already knows about atomic weapons. And that's sort of how the Cold War starts, is right there. And so Truman is America's first Cold War president. He is also still president when when the war in Korea starts, right? And it becomes sort of his fault because they can't lose China, right? So they've lost, but they did. So when I say lose China, what I mean is the Chinese Communist Revolution under Mao Zedong takes over China. They turn China from a democratic republic into a communist country. And for a lot of people in the United States, that was seen as losing China. Someone who we had allied ourselves with in World War II, we lost them to the forces of communism. And that comes to roost on Truman's watch. The fact that the Soviets get the bomb comes to roost on Truman's watch. The war in Korea that is fought to not a victory, but a standstill, basically happens on Truman's watch. So a lot of folks for a while thought that the Truman presidency was sort of a failure. And during his his bid for re-election, it didn't seem like he was going to do very well. Turns out he did. I'm sure you're thinking of that image of him holding up the paper that says Dewey wins. But it was a very, very narrow margin. And as I had, one of the things I had discussed at the beginning of this live stream, as a Democrat, he's voted out of office, and Eisenhower comes into office, a Republican, a very moderate Republican, but a Republican nonetheless, because people had it, and Truman hadn't done a good job. But when you look back today with all the challenges that Truman faced during his presidency, a quasi-rebellious military under Douglas MacArthur, Truman did not do a very bad job at all with the hand that he was dealt.
All right.
In my opinion. Sorry.
No, thanks. So we've got about 6 minutes left, so we're going to try to finish up with the questions we've got in the queue.
Okay, do we need to do a speed round? Or?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So next question is, why would France and Spain sell their lands here regarding the Louisiana Purchase in Florida?
All right, so why I keep forgetting they can hear you now. Spain didn't sell its lands from the Louisiana Purchase. They had been the lands of France until sort of around the American Revolution. And then they had gone back to France. They had been French, and then they had gone to Spain, and then Spain had secretly given them back to the French under the explicit instruction that they not be sold to anyone. Napoleon immediately turns around and sells them the United States so that he can have money to build up his armies to fight against Great Britain. And when the Louisiana Purchase goes through, both Spain and Great Britain consider it basically a fault. It's a sham. It's not legitimate. And so they don't consider that purchase legitimate. The United States does, and the United States puts its troops all over it and is able to hold on to it. France needs the money. That's why they sold it. Spain didn't have a choice in the matter. The Floridas, when Spain cedes those to the United States, they don't want to, but it's gotten to the point where it has become far too expensive to put enough troops there to keep the Americans out. And the Americans are bent on expansion, and they figure, you know what, the Americans are going to get this anyway. As a matter of fact, they've more or less taken most of it now. Why don't we just see if they won't pay us money so that we can get out with something? So Spain never intended to sell these lands, but in both instances sort of had the decision forced upon them.
All right. Our next question is, did FDR serve four full terms, or did he die in his fourth term?
You got it right on that one. He died in his fourth term, not very long into it. It was unprecedented. Remember, the Constitution doesn't put a limit on how many times a president can serve. It was assumed that George Washington would be the first president, and when he served only 2 terms and then retired from office, the force of his personality set a precedent that every president followed up until that point. But FDR, again, the Depression and the Second World War was unwilling to give up the reins of power at such a crucial time in American and world history, and obviously most of the American electorate agreed with him. But it was after FDR's death that a constitutional amendment was added that limited a president to only 2 terms.
All right. Our next viewer is curious about the springs in North Georgia, particularly Porter Springs near Dahlonega. They say, I was reading how this used to be a popular resort in the 1800s and how it is now a ghost town. Researching an article about James Longstreet, and apparently he and his wife spent their honeymoon there. So maybe you could talk about the resort.
So there are several, or there were, I should say, several springs in this area. Mineral springs, right? It's hot water that comes from the ground. They're very strong, they're heavy in minerals and things like that. And the idea is that bathing, basically sitting in the warm springs, in the mineral springs, whether they're hot or cold, is going to be very helpful. The minerals are going to come into your system. It's going to be fresh air that you breathe. And so to accommodate that, in Dahlonega, in Gainesville, in White County, and other areas around here, resorts basically grew up. If there was a spring, actually I live not too far away from a road called White Sulphur Springs, and there used to be a resort there, just a nice hotel with a restaurant and amenities and things like that. So people would come to restore their health or to just maintain their health, stay in the resort for a week or two. They would have a place to sleep. They would have a place to eat. They might go on some excursions, but the point was that they would go take the waters, as they said. And people have been taking the waters since the ancient world, right? The Romans built baths in areas where these natural springs would occur and basically built huge complexes over them. And the Romans were pretty clean and pretty healthy people comparatively. And so that's what these resorts were. And there were, I don't know the exact number, but I can tell you around the turn of the century, the 19th to 20th century in this area, there were multiple resorts in the springs in this area.
All right, this last question is a pretty cool one. Who were the first historians?
Who were the first historians? I can tell you that right now. His name was Herodotus. He was an ancient Greek. He was from, I believe, Athens. And he was writing about the Peloponnesian Wars. And it seems weird to us that the idea of putting down a narrative of things that have happened in the past in written form is a new thing, and yet that's what it was in ancient Greece. Most of the writing of ancient Greece up until this point had been based around the gods, around religion, around family houses and things like that. But Herodotus decides to put things down on paper, and he begins to tell a story. Now, he's telling his own version, right? He's the first one. He's having to find his way. And so a lot of times, like if there's a famous speech that a Greek leader is giving, I would probably guarantee, doesn't know what that leader said, but he'll write basically saying, I'm not sure what he said, but here's what he should have said because this is what really was going on. And then he'll just put this long speech down. And a lot of the sources, there's spelling issues, not spelling issues, but transliteration of different names from different languages and things like that. But Herodotus puts down his first histories. As a matter of fact, later on, rather than the father of history, he was called the father of lies because some of this stuff is somewhat unreliable. An epitaph that I think could apply to historians up to the present day based upon how they're doing. But yes, if you want to read some very fascinating stuff, go back to Herodotus, the ancient Greek who is considered the father of history. And I guess that's a good place to end. That's all we have time for today here at the Northeast Georgia History Center. We are so glad that you are still coming to hang out with us and enjoy the offerings that we have. Please become a digital member. There is information in the chat on how to do that. It's going to give you access to a lot of different things that are exclusive live streams. We're going to make sure when we do open again and when we do start having our on-site educational programs that our digital members are able to participate in those in some way. We haven't quite figured that out. We're always willing also for you to send us some ideas on some live streams or some programs we could do for you digitally. But the most important thing that we want is for you to know that we appreciate you and for you to share this and what we do with all your friends and all your family and anyone that happens to have a computer device that they can hook up to the internet. So, until the next time we meet, I'm Glen Kyle, and stay safe and take care.